Akbar the Great. You know, when you hear that name, it brings to mind a certain image, right? A tolerant, wise, unifying ruler from the history books. But what if that's not the whole story? In this explainer, we're going to dig into a pretty controversial perspective that completely flips the script on one of history's most famous emperors. So, before we jump into the deep end, let's just quickly refresh our memory on the Akbar that we all learned about in school. This is the version of the story that's really shaped how we've seen him for generations. The story we usually get is of Akbar the Great, this visionary leader who brought people together, loved the arts, and was famously open-minded and tolerant of all kinds of different religions. This is the legacy that's been passed down, often backed up by the writings of his very own court historians. Okay, but here's where things get really interesting. The source we're looking at today, it doesn't just disagree with that story, it challenges the entire narrative. It basically forces us to question everything we thought we knew. I mean, that's a pretty bold statement, isn't it? This line right here directly confronts centuries of accepted history. It's basically telling us there is a much darker, untold story hiding in the shadows. All right, so what is this other side of the story? The source we're looking at doesn't just make vague claims, it lays out some incredibly serious accusations. Let's take a look at what it says. 30,000. Just let that number sink in for a second. It's a huge number, and according to our source, it's directly connected to one of Akbar's most famous military victories. So here's the story behind that number. This source claims that after his army conquered the famous fort of Chittor, way back in 1567, Akbar himself gave a direct order to massacre 30,000 unarmed civilians. I mean, if that's true, that one event completely shatters the image of him as a tolerant ruler. And it doesn't stop there. The source also alleges that Hindu temples were destroyed under Akbar's rule and that people were forced to convert. And get this, it even takes another look at his famous Dini Ilahi, that unique faith he created. Now, that's usually held up as the ultimate proof of his tolerance, right? But this source reinterprets it as an attempt by Akbar to set himself up as some kind of godlike figure. So, where does that leave us? We're looking at two completely different, totally contradictory portraits of the same man. How do you even begin to make sense of that? So, on one hand, you have the kind, tolerant emperor that we've all heard about, and on the other, you have this picture of a really smart but incredibly cruel and ruthless ruler. It's a massive contrast, and the source we're looking at argues that the second one is the real Akbar. This is really the fundamental question at the heart of this whole debate. Which one was he? The tolerant leader that history remembers, or a brilliant but brutal monarch? Which of these two portraits is closer to the truth? And all of this brings us to this source's final point, which is about more than just Akbar, really. It's about how we should think about history in general. And here's the main takeaway. We need to look past the fancy titles and the simple labels. Calling someone the Great is powerful, for sure, but it can also hide a much more complicated and sometimes a much darker reality. So, we'll leave you with this question to mull over. After hearing this alternative perspective, what do you think? Was Akbar the great unifier, the ruthless conqueror, or something else entirely? Maybe the real lesson here is that history is never ever as simple as it seems.